What a fool!
3 years from now, a worthless, foul-smelling swamp would be pumping enough pure spring water to save 30 acres of drought-stricken farmland. And the very men laughing at it today. They would be lining up at a 58-year-old black man's porch, hats in their hands, begging for his help. But to understand how Eli Granger pulled off the impossible, you have to go back to a stifling July morning at the county tax auction. The air in that room was thick with sweat and cheap cigar smoke. Eli sat in the back row, his calloused hands resting quietly on his knees. He had $400 in his pocket, every cent he owned in the world. That was the day Coach Henderson, the wealthiest farmer in the county, looked down at those rough hands and said the one thing you should never say to a well-digger's son. The county tax auction was held in the basement of the municipal building. The air in there was thick, heavy, with the smell of cheap coffee and damp concrete. A ceiling fan wobbled overhead, ticking like a metronome, doing absolutely nothing to cut the July heat. It was 10:15 in the morning and tempers were already flaring. In the back row, away from the loud conversations of the local farmers, sat Eli Granger. He was 58 years old. He wore a faded chambray shirt buttoned to the collar despite the heat. His hands rested flat on his knees. If you looked at those hands, you saw the map of a hard life. Thick calluses, scars that never quite healed right. Dirt permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles. He was a man who worked for other people. A hired hand. Up at the front, the auctioneer mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. Next parcel. Parcel 42. 5 acres on the east edge of the county line. Mostly wetland. Starting bid is $200. A ripple of laughter went through the room. Parcel 42 wasn't just wetland, it was a swamp. 5 acres of foul-smelling mud, overgrown reeds, and stagnant water. You couldn't build on it. You couldn't plant corn on it. Cattle wouldn't drink from it. It had been sitting abandoned for 12 years, because even the county didn't want the liability. 200, the auctioneer repeated, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Do I hear 200? Silence. A few men shook their heads. Someone coughed. Then a voice spoke from the back row, quiet but firm. I'll give you $400. Every head in the room turned. The laughter stopped instantly. They looked at Eli. He didn't shrink under their stares. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, his hands perfectly still on his knees. He didn't fidget. He didn't smile. We have a bid of $400, the auctioneer said, hesitating for a fraction of a second. Any other bids? Nobody spoke. They were too busy staring. Why would a black man who lived in a rented trailer, who worked 60 hours a week, fixing tractors and digging post holes, throw away 400 hard-earned dollars on a pit of useless mud? Going, once the auctioneer called out. Going twice. Sold. For $400. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the basement. Eli Granger was now a landowner. He had just spent his life savings. Every last cent he had in the bank was gone. The room broke into a murmur of whispers as Eli stood up. He walked toward the clerk's table to sign the papers. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing against his back. Standing near the aisle was Coach Henderson. Henderson owned 3,500 acres of prime agricultural land in the county. He was the kind of man who believed that money bought respect, and he had plenty of both. As Eli passed by, a farmer next to Henderson nudged him with an elbow and snickered. Henderson didn't lower his voice. He wanted the room to hear him. Eli, he said, stepping slightly into the aisle. You do good work on my land. You're a fine hired hand. What do you need your own dirt for, especially a swamp? You trying to play farmer now? The implication hung in the heavy air. You don't belong here. You shouldn't own land. The room went dead silent. You could hear the ceiling fan ticking overhead. Tick, tick, tick. Everyone watched Eli, waiting to see if he would snap, waiting for him to give them a reason to confirm what they already thought of him. Eli stopped. He looked at Henderson. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He simply offered a brief, polite nod. Just an investment, Mr. Henderson. Have a good morning. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He walked past Henderson, paid his $400 in worn $20 bills, signed the deed, and walked out the door. But as he stepped out into the blinding July sunlight, Eli reached into his breast pocket. His thick fingers brushed against the frayed leather cover of a small notebook. He pulled it out just far enough to see the binding. He didn't buy that swamp on a whim. He knew exactly what he had just purchased. And he knew it because of the man who had owned that notebook before him. 30 years ago, Eli's father, Isaiah Granger, was the best well digger in 3 counties. Isaiah didn't use ground-penetrating radar. He didn't have a geology degree. He had a 6th sense for water. He could walk a piece of land, feel the temperature of the soil, study the way the morning dew settled on the grass, and tell you exactly where to dig. But it was 30 years ago, when the county commissioned the first official hydrogeological map to plan the modern irrigation grid. They brought in engineers from the city, men with clipboards and clean boots. They mapped the aquifers. They drew the lines that would determine whose land was valuable and whose was worthless. Isaiah tried to tell them they were wrong. He tried to show them that the main aquifer didn't run straight under Henderson's property. It hooked east. It ran directly beneath parcel 42, but they didn't listen. Why would a team of educated engineers listen to a black man with dirt under his fingernails? They dismissed him. They drew their maps. And Isaiah Granger spent the rest of his life digging shallow wells for poor farmers struggling to make ends meet, while men like Henderson got rich off the water grid. But Isaiah didn't forget. He spent his evenings sitting at the kitchen table writing in that leather-bound notebook. He mapped the underground streams himself. He recorded soil temperatures, rock formations, and historical flood lines. Eli remembered the day his father gave him the notebook. Eli was 28 then, angry at the world for how his father had been treated. He had wanted Isaiah to fight back, to go to the county board and demand they fix the maps. Isaiah had just shaken his head, tapping his calloused finger against the leather cover. "Don't waste your energy yelling at people who are determined to be deaf, Eli," he had said. "The truth doesn't need your anger, it just needs time." Then Isaiah had handed him the book. "Remember this, son. The men in that office, they see what they want to see, but the dirt doesn't care what color your skin is. It only cares if you know how to read it." Standing outside the municipal building, feeling the $400 receipt burning a hole in his pocket, Eli slid the notebook back into his shirt. He walked to his beat-up 15-year-old truck. The men inside were still laughing at him. Let them laugh, he thought. They were laughing at a swamp. But Eli wasn't looking at a swamp. He was looking at a 30-year-old secret, and the clock was ticking. For 9 months, Eli Granger didn't touch a shovel. He didn't bring in heavy machinery. He just watched. Every morning at 5 a.m., before the sun crested the ridge, Eli parked his truck by the edge of the swamp. He would step out into the freezing pre-dawn air, the smell of rotting mud stinging his nose, and stand perfectly still. He watched how the morning fog settled thickest in the northeast corner. He noted the spots where the frost melted first. He measured the water levels by the stains on the cattail stalks. And he wrote it all down in his father's leather-bound notebook. Naturally, in a town where everybody's business is talked about over morning coffee, people noticed. Down at the local feed store, the jokes practically wrote themselves. "Saw the hired hand out by the swamp again today," a farmer would say, leaning against the counter, just standing there, staring at the mud. "Think he's playing farmer, trying to grow mosquitoes maybe." The laughter was easy and cruel. To them, Eli was just a foolish old man who had thrown away his life savings on a pipe dream. They called him crazy. They called him a fool. Eli heard the whispers, of course. In a small farming community, you can't avoid them. But he never engaged. He didn't try to explain the complex hydrogeology of bentonite clay to men who only saw the color of his skin. He just kept showing up at 5 a.m., recording the subtle shifts in the water table that the naked eye would miss. He endured being the town joke because he knew what they didn't. You can't force the land to yield its secrets on your schedule. You have to wait for the land to speak. And the land was speaking loud and clear. The water wasn't stagnant. It was trapped. The fog patterns proved it. But as the months wore on, the isolation started to take its toll. The jokes at the feed store got louder. The stares at the gas station got longer. And Eli, despite his iron will, wasn't just bearing this burden alone. He never went out to the swamp by himself on the weekends. On Saturday mornings, sitting next to him in the cab of the truck was his 11-year-old granddaughter Naomi. She didn't understand the complex water tables or the historical floodlines. She just loved spending time with her grandpa. To her, the swamp wasn't a joke. It was their special project. One Saturday in April, after a cold morning of logging data, Eli took Naomi to the Route 7 diner for breakfast. The diner was packed with the usual weekend crowd. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon. Eli and Naomi found a booth in the back. As they were looking over the menus, Coach Henderson walked in with a couple of his foremen. Henderson owned the town practically. He carried himself with the kind of loud confidence that demanded space. The waitress, a woman named Betty, who had known Eli for 20 years, hurried over to Henderson's table to take their order. As she poured their coffee, the heavy ceramic mug hit the table with a loud clatter. Henderson laughed at something one of his men said, then glanced over at Eli's booth. Betty followed his gaze. She looked at Eli, then looked back at Henderson and sighed. "Your hand buying trouble again, Coach," she said loud enough to carry over the clatter of silverware. "Here he's out there talking to the mud now." Henderson chuckled a low, rumbling sound. "Let him play in the dirt, Betty. Keeps him out of trouble when he's not on my clock." The words weren't a shout. They were worse. They were casual, dismissive. To them, Eli wasn't a neighbor, or a fellow landowner, or even a man. He was just your hand, a tool that belonged to Henderson. Eli didn't look up from his menu. His jaw tightened just a fraction of an inch. But Naomi looked up. Her eyes darted from the waitress to Henderson, and then back to her grandfather. She was 11. She was old enough to understand the tone, if not the exact meaning of the words. She saw the smirk on Henderson's face. She saw the way the waitress dismissed her grandfather like he was a stray dog. Eli didn't cause a scene. He didn't stand up and shout about dignity or respect. That wasn't his way. He quietly closed his menu. He pulled a $10 bill from his wallet, double the price of the coffees they hadn't even ordered yet, and set it on the table. "Come on, baby," he said softly to Naomi. "We're going." He walked out of the diner with his head held high, holding his granddaughter's hand. But the drive back to the trailer was suffocatingly quiet. They were parked outside their rented trailer. The engine was off, but neither of them made a move to get out. The silence in the cab of the truck was heavy, thicker than the summer humidity. Naomi sat staring at the dashboard, her small hands clutching the straps of her backpack. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Finally, she turned to him. "Papa," she asked, her voice trembling slightly, "why did that lady call you his hand?" It was the question Eli had been dreading. It was the moment every black grandfather in that town eventually had to face, the moment you have to explain the ugly reality of the world to your grandchild. Eli took a deep breath. He looked at his hands resting on the steering wheel. The thick calluses, the dirt permanently etched into the skin. He reached over and gently wiped a tear from the corner of Naomi's eye. His rough thumb was surprisingly tender against her cheek. He could have told her that Henderson was a bad man. He could have told her that the world was unfair. But instead, he remembered the lesson his own father had taught him 30 years ago, sitting at that kitchen table with the leather-bound notebook. "Naomi, look at me," Eli said, his voice steady and calm. "Do you know why they call me that?" She shook her head. "Because that's all they see, baby," Eli said, repeating Isaiah's exact words. "They look at me and they see a pair of hands to do their heavy lifting. They look at our swamp and they see worthless mud. They only see what's on the surface." He picked up the old leather notebook from the dashboard and placed it in her lap. "But the dirt," Eli continued, tapping the cover of the book. "The dirt knows different. The dirt doesn't care what they call me. It doesn't care how much money Coach Henderson has in the bank. It only cares if you know how to read it, and we know how to read it." Naomi looked down at the notebook, running her fingers over the frayed edges. The tears stopped. A small, determined look crossed her face. She nodded. Eli realized right then that observation time was over. He couldn't just stand by the swamp and take notes anymore. He had to prove it, not just for his father's legacy, but for his granddaughter's future. The very next morning, Eli walked into the First National Bank. He didn't go to the teller window. He went straight to the manager's desk, and he withdrew the absolute last of his savings, every single penny. But what the farmers at the feed store didn't know, what Coach Henderson didn't know, was that tomorrow the quiet was going to end. Tomorrow, Eli Granger was bringing in the heavy machinery. The sign above the equipment yard read Benton County Heavy Machinery. It was the only place within a 50-mile radius where a man could rent a piece of industrial earth-moving equipment. Eli walked into the air-conditioned office just after 8 a.m. The manager, A thick-necked man named Miller was sitting behind a glass-topped desk. He didn't bother to look up when the front door chimed. He just kept tapping his pen against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. "I need to rent the John Deere 135G excavator," Eli said, quietly standing on the other side of the desk. 3 days. Miller finally stopped tapping. He slowly looked Eli up and down, his eyes lingering on the faded chambray shirt and the mud-caked boots. "That's a heavy piece of machinery, Eli. Standard deposit is $500, plus the daily rental rate." "I know the rate," Eli said, reaching a calloused hand into his pocket. "Well, things have changed," Miller said, leaning back in his leather chair. The pen started tapping again. "I hear you're planning to take my machine out into that bottomless mud pit you bought on Route 7. A swamp like that, it's a high-liability environment. The tracks could sink into the clay. The engine could flood. For a job like that, the deposit is $1,000. Cash." It was a blatant lie. The standard deposit was $500 no matter where the machine was going. Miller knew it. Eli knew it. It was just another barrier, another subtle way of saying, "You don't get to play the game, you but in the background." Eli didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or accuse Miller of discrimination. He simply reached deep into his front pocket and pulled out a thick wad of bills. They weren't crisp $100 bills. They were worn, crumpled 20s and 10s, the absolute last of the money he had withdrawn from the bank. Slowly, methodically, Eli counted out $1,000 onto the glass desk. The tapping of Miller's pen stopped completely. 3 days, Eli repeated, his voice perfectly level. He had just handed over his grocery money for the next 2 months. He had nothing left to fall back on. If he was wrong about the water, he was ruined. He drove the massive yellow excavator out of the yard, the heavy diesel engine thrumming beneath him. But the complications were just beginning. By noon, Eli had the excavator positioned at the exact northeast corner of the swamp. He was standing on the tracks checking the hydraulic fluid when a White County-issued pickup truck pulled up, blocking the dirt access road. Out stepped Curtis, the county agricultural extension agent. Curtis wasn't a mean-spirited man like Coach Henderson. He was a bureaucrat, a man who firmly believed in official maps, geological charts, and stamped reports. "Eli," Curtis called out, walking cautiously over to the edge of the mud. "Mind if we talk for a minute?" Eli climbed down from the heavy metal tracks. The midday heat was already oppressive, shimmering in waves above the tall grass. He walked over to his red cooler, pulled out a plastic cup, filled it with ice water from a thermos, and handed it to Curtis. Curtis took a sip, looking uncomfortably at the massive machine towering over them. "Listen, Eli. I'm not here in an official capacity today. I'm here as a neighbor. I don't want to see you throw your life savings away on this. I pulled the hydrogeological maps on this parcel this morning." "I know what the maps say, Mr. Curtis," Eli replied calmly. "Then you know this is a dead zone," Curtis insisted, pulling a rolled-up blueprint from his back pocket. "The main aquifer is 2 miles west of here, right under Henderson's acreage. This water you're looking at, it's just surface runoff trapped by a hard clay basin. If you dig here, all you're going to get is a deeper mud puddle." It was the ultimate dismissal. The whole system, the maps, the educated engineers, the county officials had decided 30 years ago that Isaiah Granger was wrong. And now they were trying to tell his son the exact same thing. "I appreciate your concern," Eli said, a faint smile touching his lips as he glanced at the rolled-up map. "I really do. But I'm going to trust the dirt on this one." Curtis shook his head, sighed heavily, and handed the plastic cup back. "It's your funeral, Eli." As the white truck drove away, the implication hung in the thick air. If Eli sank that excavator into the mud and failed, no one was coming to help him. He was completely on his own. Eli didn't hesitate. He climbed back up into the cab of the excavator. He turned the key. The massive diesel engine roared to life, tearing through the quiet afternoon air. A thick plume of black smoke rolled into the sky. While Eli was firing up the excavator, the weather across Benton County was shifting violently. The agonizing drought that had been threatening the region for months finally locked its jaws. The creeks on the west side of the county began to run bone dry. Coach Henderson's massive irrigation pivots were pumping sand and air instead of water. The county was getting thirsty, and the panic was just beginning to set in. But Eli Granger wasn't looking at the weather. He was only focused on the mud in front of him. He engaged the hydraulics. The massive steel bucket swung out over the northeast corner of the swamp, the exact spot where the morning fog always lingered the longest. Clank. He dropped the bucket into the black, foul-smelling mud. He pulled the heavy joystick back. The machine groaned, vibrating against his boots as it tore into the earth, pulling up a ton of wet clay and tangled roots. He dumped the first load to the side, then the second, then the third. On the fourth scoop, 12 feet down into the muck, the steel teeth of the bucket hit something hard. It wasn't the dull thud of a rotting tree root. It was a sharp, metallic clang that echoed loudly over the roar of the diesel engine. Eli immediately killed the throttle. The sudden silence in the swamp was deafening. Naomi, who had been sitting safely on the tailgate of the pickup truck doing her homework, ran over to the edge of the pit. "Papa, what did you hit?" Eli climbed down from the cab. His heart was hammering against his ribs, though his face remained perfectly stoic. He slid down the steep, muddy bank into the 12-foot crater. He dropped to his knees in the muck and began digging frantically with his bare hands. The thick black mud coated his arms up to the elbows. His fingers scraped against something solid. It wasn't a natural rock. It was perfectly flat and smooth on top. He pulled it out of the mud, his muscles straining against the suction, and carried it up the bank. It was a heavy rectangular slab of fieldstone. Naomi grabbed a bottle of water from the red cooler and poured it over the stone, washing away decades of grime. As the black mud washed away, 2 large letters deeply carved into the center of the stone revealed themselves. I.G. Isaiah Granger. Eli stared at the initials. His father hadn't just mapped the underground stream 30 years ago. He had secretly dug a test well to prove it. He had hit water, capped it with this heavy stone to hide it from the dismissive county engineers, and waited for the day someone would finally believe him. Eli looked up at his granddaughter. His calloused hands were shaking just slightly. "He was right," Naomi, Eli whispered. "He was right all along." But they weren't out of the woods yet. The excavator was only rented for 3 days, and out on the dirt highway a thick cloud of dust was approaching. People had seen the black smoke. They had heard the diesel engine. The audience was arriving. By mid-afternoon on the second day of the rental, the audience had grown. The thick plume of diesel smoke from Eli's excavator had acted like a beacon. First, it was just a couple of farmers slowing down in their trucks on Route 7. Then they parked. By 3 p.m., a small crowd had gathered at the edge of the dirt road, leaning against the hoods of their vehicles, arms crossed, watching the show. Among them was Coach Henderson. He had driven out in his pristine silver F-250, accompanied by 5 of his foremen. Henderson was losing thousands of dollars a day to the drought, but he wasn't going to pass up a chance to watch the town fool finally bankrupt himself. Eli ignored them. The excavator was a massive 15-foot crater now, and he was working the bucket with surgical precision. He had expanded the hole outward from the stone marker his father had left behind. Down in the pit, the bucket scraped against something else. It wasn't stone this time. It sounded hollow. Eli stopped the machine. The diesel engine idled down to a low, rhythmic rumble. From the road, one of Henderson's foremen cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted over the engine noise, just like his daddy digging holes nobody asked for. The men around the silver truck erupted into cruel, booming laughter. Eli didn't look at them. He didn't flinch. He calmly reached over and turned the key. The massive diesel engine died. The sudden silence that washed over the swamp was absolute. Without the roar of the machine, the only sound was the wind rustling through the dead cattails and the dry hacking cough of one of the farmers. Eli grabbed a short-handled shovel from the cab and swung himself down onto the tracks. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. He jumped down into the muddy 15-foot crater. The crowd on the road stopped laughing. They leaned forward, straining their necks to see what the old man was doing at the bottom of the hole. Down in the muck, Eli was clearing away the mud by hand. He uncovered a section of ancient terracotta piping. It was thick, porous, and crumbling at the edges. It was an old agricultural drain tile from the early 1900s, buried long before the county ever drew their official maps. But it wasn't the pipe that mattered. It was what surrounded it. Eli sank to his knees in the bottom of the crater. The mud down here was different. It wasn't the foul-smelling, rotting organic muck from the surface. It was dense, heavy. Up on the road, Henderson let out a loud, mocking whistle. "You strike oil down there yet, Eli?" Eli ignored the taunt. He reached out with his thick, calloused right hand and scooped up a handful of the dark gray earth. He didn't just look at it, he engaged with it. He slowly rubbed the heavy mud between his thumb and index finger. A seasoned farmer knows that regular topsoil or silt feels gritty like fine sandpaper, but this felt perfectly smooth, like wet bar soap, and incredibly sticky. It clung to his skin, resisting every attempt to wipe it off. The farmers on the road went dead silent. They were men of the land. They recognized a man who was deeply reading the soil, not just playing in it. Then Eli did something that made the men up on the road physically recoil. He brought the handful of gray mud up to his face. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, taking in the raw, earthy scent. Then, he touched the tip of his tongue to the mud. He tasted it. "Good Lord," one of the foremen muttered, disgusted. The old man's lost his mind, but Eli hadn't lost his mind. It was a classic old-school field test for soil composition, a technique taught by master agronomists a century ago, long before digital sensors and lab testing. Gritty meant silica, salty meant mineral buildup. But this tasted incredibly dry on the tongue, pulling the moisture right out of his saliva, leaving a chalky, earthy residue. Eli opened his eyes. He slowly stood up, wiping his mouth on the back of his smutty sleeve. He looked up out of the crater, his eyes locking directly onto Coach Henderson. "Bentonite," Eli said. His voice wasn't a shout, but in the dead silence of the afternoon, it carried perfectly to the road. The older farmers in the crowd suddenly shifted on their feet. Their mocking smiles vanished. They knew exactly what bentonite clay was. Bentonite is a highly absorbent volcanic clay. When it gets wet, it swells up to 15 times its original size, forming an impenetrable watertight seal. "This isn't a swamp," Eli called out, his voice steady, echoing out of the pit. And it never was. "It's a bowl." He grabbed his short-handled shovel. 100 years ago, somebody laid this terracotta pipe to drain surface water. But over the decades, a thick vein of bentonite clay swelled up around it. It formed a perfect watertight seal beneath the topsoil. The rain couldn't drain. The groundwater couldn't rise. It just trapped a few feet of rotting water on the surface, making it look like a bottomless swamp. He drove the tip of the shovel hard into the gray clay right next to the ancient pipe. Crack! The clay seal didn't just yield. It fractured like a giant porcelain plate. Instantly, a loud, sucking glug sound echoed through the crater. The foul, stagnant water that had been sitting in the bottom of the pit suddenly swirled into a vortex. The broken bentonite seal had opened a drain. Within seconds, the trapped surface water vanished, sucked down into the earth, leaving behind firm, solid ground. But Eli wasn't finished. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the frayed leather notebook. His father's notebook. He held it up in the air, the leather dark with sweat and mud. "You all laughed at my father 30 years ago," Eli said, his voice rising, carrying the weight of 3 decades of quiet dignity. "Your engineers drew their maps and you told him he was an uneducated fool." He pointed the shovel straight down into the newly exposed dry earth at the bottom of the crater. "But the maps were wrong. The main aquifer didn't hook west under your land, Mr. Henderson. It hooked east, right under this bentonite seal." The crowd on the road was paralyzed. The silence was heavy, thick, with the sudden, crushing realization of what the old man had just uncovered. Eli looked up at the silver truck, his eyes boring into Henderson. "My father marked this spot 30 years ago, before any of your massive irrigation pivots existed. And now I'm going to finish his work." Eli turned back to the massive excavator. The crowd watched breathless as he climbed into the cab. Henderson wasn't laughing anymore. The smirk was completely wiped from his face, because if Eli Granger was right, he was standing on top of the largest untapped water source in Benton County, and Henderson's empire was currently dying of thirst. The county engineers arrived 2 days later, armed with modern ground-penetrating radar, laser surveying equipment, and a heavy sense of disbelief. They parked their pristine white trucks along the edge of Route 7 and walked down to the crater, fully expecting to find a muddy puddle. Instead, they found a pristine 5-acre reservoir. Once Eli had shattered the bentonite seal, the pressure holding back the underground stream was released. Clear, icy cold water from the main aquifer had rushed up from the earth, filling the natural basin that the clay had originally formed. Eli didn't even have to build a tank. He simply used the excavator to smooth out the sides of the crater, packing the excavated bentonite clay against the earthen walls to create a perfect watertight natural reservoir. The head surveyor, a man young enough to be Eli's son, stood at the edge of the water. He held a digital tablet in one hand and a depth gauge in the other. He looked from the water to the tablet and then back to the water. The digital maps, the official records that the county had relied on for 3 decades, were unequivocally wrong. "The flow rate is incredible," the young surveyor murmured, staring at his screen. "It's pumping thousands of gallons an hour. This isn't just a surface spring, Mr. Granger. You've tapped directly into the deepest part of the regional aquifer." Eli stood next to him, his hands resting comfortably in the pockets of his faded jeans. He didn't gloat. He just watched the afternoon sun reflect off the crystal-clear water. The news spread through Benton County faster than a wildfire. The worthless $400 mud pit was suddenly the most valuable piece of real estate in a 50-mile radius. In the span of a single week, property appraisers from the city drove out to reevaluate the parcel. With a guaranteed high-volume freshwater source capable of irrigating not just Eli's 5 acres but at least 25 neighboring acres, the land value skyrocketed. The mud pit that everyone had laughed at was now officially appraised at over $180,000. But while Eli's reservoir was full, the rest of the county was burning. The drought had settled over the region like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Day after day, the sun beat down relentlessly. The massive 500-acre cornfields that made up Coach Henderson's empire were turning a sickly pale yellow. The stalks were brittle, the leaves curling inward in a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. Henderson's irrigation pivots, those massive metal structures that usually sprayed millions of gallons of water across his fields, stood completely still. His deep wells, drilled based on the county's flawed maps, had finally run dry. The western edge of the aquifer, which he had relied on for decades, was depleted. Henderson wasn't a man who surrendered easily. He threw money at the problem. He hired a team of private hydrogeologists from the city. They arrived in sleek SUVs, unloaded thousands of dollars worth of advanced ground-penetrating radar equipment, and spent 3 days crisscrossing his massive farm. Late on a Tuesday afternoon, Henderson stood at the edge of his dying cornfield, watching the specialists pack up their gear. The lead geologist walked over, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Coach," the specialist said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The radar isn't picking up any significant flow. We can drill deeper, but you'd just be hitting bedrock. The water has shifted east." Henderson stared at the specialist. He listened to the steady, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the radar equipment being loaded into the SUV, a futile mechanical sound that offered no salvation. He looked down at his own hands. They were clean, perfectly manicured. They had never dug a well. They had never felt the temperature of the soil or tasted the raw earth to find clay. He had spent his entire life trusting machines, maps, and men in clean boots. He had built his empire on the assumption that he was the smartest man in the room, and that men who worked with their hands were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. Now those clean hands couldn't save his farm. His tractors were useless. His money couldn't buy rain. The brutal reality of nature was staring him in the face. You can't bully the earth into giving you water. He was going to lose the harvest. If the drought lasted another month, he might lose the farm itself. There was only one man in the entire county sitting on enough water to save his crops. The old man he had publicly humiliated. The man he had called a hand. The drive from Henderson's sprawling estate to Eli's rented trailer took less than 20 minutes, but for Henderson, it felt like a funeral march. He pulled his silver F-250 into the gravel driveway just as the sun was beginning to set. Eli was sitting on the front porch in an old rocking chair, quietly reading his father's leather-bound notebook. Naomi was sitting on the steps, drawing in a sketchbook. When the silver truck crunched to a halt, Naomi looked up. Her eyes narrowed defensively. She remembered the man from the diner. She remembered the laughter. Henderson stepped out of the truck. He didn't slam the door. He didn't stride forward with his usual demanding presence. He walked slowly, heavily toward the porch. As he reached the bottom of the wooden steps, Henderson did something no one in Benton County had ever seen him do. He reached up, took off his expensive Stetson hat, and held it tightly against his chest. He stood in the dirt yard, looking up at the man sitting on the porch. The power dynamic of the entire town shifted in that single quiet moment. "Evening," Eli Henderson said, his voice stripped of its usual boom. It was quiet, raspy. "Evening, Mr. Henderson," Eli replied, closing the notebook and setting it gently on his lap. He didn't stand up. Henderson swallowed hard. I have a problem, Eli." The wells are dry. The geologists say the water moved east. I'm looking at losing 30% of my crop by the end of the week, 60% by the end of the month. Eli looked at him, his expression unreadable. He let the silence hang in the warm evening air. He could have made Henderson beg. He could have reminded him of the joke at the diner. He could have told him to get off his property. I know I haven't been a good neighbor. Henderson finally forced the words out, staring down at the brim of his hat. I know what I said, but I'm asking for your help. Eli, would you walk my land with me? I'll pay whatever you ask. Name your price for the consulting, name your price for the water rights. I'll sign the check right now. It was the ultimate victory. The richest man in the county begging for salvation from the man he had treated like a stray dog. Eli sat quietly in his rocking chair. He looked at Naomi, who was watching him intently. This was the moment. This was the lesson she would remember for the rest of her life. Eli slowly stood up from the rocking chair. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking down at Henderson. Your money is no good here, Coach, Eli said, his voice calm and steady. Henderson flinched, his shoulders sagging as if he had been struck. He had expected to pay a heavy price, but he hadn't expected a flat refusal. He nodded slowly, turning to walk back to his truck. But I'll walk your land. Eli's voice stopped him. Henderson turned back, confusion written across his face. I don't understand. Why? Eli placed his calloused hand on the wooden railing. 30 years ago, my father walked your acreage. He mapped the veins. He knew exactly where the water was hiding beneath your topsoil. He tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen. Eli picked up the leather notebook and held it out. I'm not doing this for your money, Mr. Henderson. I'm doing it to finish what Isaiah Granger started. I'll find your water. But from now on, when you look at me, or when you look at my granddaughter, you remember exactly who saved your farm. Henderson stood perfectly still. He looked at the notebook, then up at Eli. For the first time in his life, he didn't see a hired hand. He saw a master of his craft. He saw a man of immense, unbreakable dignity. I will, Eli Henderson whispered. You have my word. 3 years later, the landscape of Benton County had completely transformed. The $400 mud pit on Route 7 was no longer a joke. It was the beating heart of a thriving ecosystem. Eli's 5 acres were lush and green, bursting with robust crops that defied the region's harsh summers. The natural bentonite reservoir he had uncovered was carefully managed, supplying pure, icy cold water, not just to his own fields, but to the surrounding properties as well. He hadn't gouged his neighbors. He hadn't charged Henderson exorbitant fees. He simply sold the water at a fair, honest agricultural rate. It was enough to secure a comfortable life, put away a substantial college hunt for Naomi, and finally buy his own tractor, a brand new bright green John Deere. But the most significant change wasn't the landscape, it was the legacy. It was late August, and the afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the fields. Down by the edge of the corn, 14-year-old Naomi was kneeling in the dirt. She wasn't just playing, she was working. She reached down, her hands sinking into the topsoil. She scooped up a handful of earth and slowly rubbed it between her fingers. She listened to the faint, gritty sound of the silt. She smelled the sharp, acidic tang of nitrogen in the soil. She wasn't relying on a digital sensor. She was reading the land. Eli stood a few feet away, leaning against the wooden fence, watching her. His hair was completely silver now, but his posture was as straight and proud as ever. Naomi wiped her hands on her denim overalls. She reached into the bib pocket and pulled out a brand new leather-bound notebook. It didn't say I.G. on the cover. Deeply embossed into the fresh leather were the initials N.G. She looked up at her grandfather, her eyes bright with understanding. It's acidic, Papa. We need to lay down lime before the winter freeze. Eli smiled, a deep, warm expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Write it down, baby, he said softly. The land's been trying to tell you something. You just have to know how to listen. She opened the notebook and began to write, her pen flying across the crisp, blank pages. The knowledge hadn't been lost. The 30 years of mockery, the dismissive county engineers, the arrogant laughter at the diner, none of it mattered anymore. Isaiah Granger's genius had finally been proven, and now it was safely in the hands of the next generation. Sometimes the greatest treasures in this world aren't found on official maps or printed in government surveys. They are hidden deep in the earth, waiting for the calloused hands of those we so easily overlook. Because in the end, The dirt truly doesn't care what color your skin is, how much money you have in the bank, or what kind of truck you drive. It only yields its secrets to those who have the patience and the humility to understand it. What would you have done if an entire town laughed at your dream? Would you have given up, or would you have started digging? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe that true wisdom comes from the hands that work the earth, hit that subscribe button.